Have you ever been skiing or snowboarding? Have you ever gotten altitude sickness? I have, and trust me when I tell you, it wasn't pleasant. I went from my home on the coast to the Rocky Mountains so I could go snowboarding with my friends in Colorado. That's a change in elevation of over 10,000 feet. No, I wasn't climbing Mount Everest, but humans aren't naturally acclimated to those elevations. Anytime you ascend to an elevation or altitude over 10,000 feet, you are at risk of altitude sickness. And the higher you go, the more important it becomes for you to take special precautions. Otherwise, you can get acute altitude sickness just like me. I did not take precautions, and I pushed myself too hard, too fast. My body was struggling to get oxygen in the thin atmosphere on top of the mountain where I was snowboarding. It was hard to breathe, and so I was breathing harder and harder, grasping for air. My body was also losing water fast in the dry mountain air. I was dehydrated, and so my body was doing everything it could to get my oxygen and to hold onto my water, constricting my blood vessels, elevating my blood pressure, and increasing my heart rate. What started as a minor problem on the mountain soon turned into a big one, and my trip was eventually brought to a swift end. There's a popular misconception that there's less oxygen at high altitudes, but that's not true. Earth's atmosphere primarily consists of molecular nitrogen and oxygen, in addition to other gases like argon, carbon dioxide, and methane, amongst many others. Like all animals that live on land, we humans breathe in all of these gases, but we only use and require the oxygen. Most of the air is molecular nitrogen gas, or N2, but it's inert. It doesn't harm us if we breathe it in. Other gases, like carbon dioxide, are quite harmful to humans, but their concentrations in the atmosphere are so low that we can safely inhale them with the rest of the air. We inhale a breath of air, take out the oxygen which we need to survive, and exhale the rest. Molecular nitrogen, carbon dioxide, methane, argon, and the rest. It doesn't matter if you're breathing the air at sea level or the air above 10,000 feet. The concentration of oxygen in the air is always about 21%. 21% of the air is oxygen. 21 out of every 100 atoms of air is oxygen. So then, what is the cause of altitude sickness? The answer is pressure, or really the lack of pressure. I'll explain. The gases that make up our atmosphere are held in place near the surface of our planet by the force of gravity. Gravity prevents these gases from escaping and diffusing into the vast empty reaches of space. Gravity also creates a phenomenon called atmospheric pressure. Due to atmospheric pressure, air at low altitudes is compressed by the weight of all of the air above it. As a result, the atoms and molecules are located close together. As you move upward, the column of air becomes shorter. There becomes less and less air above you, and the weight is lessened, and the atoms and molecules have more freedom to distance themselves from one another. Altitude sickness isn't caused by too little oxygen, but rather by air that is too thin. At high altitudes, there is more room, really too much room, between oxygen molecules in the air. The molecules are too far apart, so you are forced to take more and deeper breaths just to get enough oxygen into your lungs. This breathing is exhausting. It tires you out, and makes you sick. Interestingly enough, too much oxygen can also be a bad thing. An excess of oxygen can cause cell damage and even death, a condition known as oxygen toxicity. Suffice it to say, oxygen is an essential and important part of our existence, and we have evolved to live in the nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere that exists on Earth right now. But when did our atmosphere form? Did it always have enough oxygen to support human life? And how has it changed over time? Let's begin in the beginning, at the formation of the planet in the Hadean Eon, between 4.5 and 4 billion years ago. The oceans and atmosphere of our planet probably first formed during this time, but they would have been dramatically different than they are now. The sun was likely much dimmer. The atmosphere likely contained extremely high concentrations of carbon dioxide, water, and hydrogen gas, and very little oxygen or nitrogen like you find today. In this atmosphere, the pressure would have been 27 times greater than its present levels on the surface of our planet. You find this pressure on Earth today, but only hundreds of feet below the ocean surface. There was probably a positive side to this extreme pressure. It may have allowed for the existence of liquid water on the surface, possibly even an ocean. Again, it would have been greatly different from the ocean today. There wouldn't have been life of any kind. The water would have contained no oxygen and lots of metals. Nonetheless, conditions did change over time, and the Earth moved into the Archean Eon between 4 and 2.5 billion years ago. In the Archean, the temperature of our world would have been comparable to now, but the sun was likely much dimmer, perhaps only 75% of its modern luminosity level. The Earth was likely kept warm by the greenhouse effect. The atmosphere likely contained high concentrations of carbon dioxide and maybe methane. It would have almost or entirely lacked oxygen, so you wouldn't have been able to survive in those times. There was an ocean in the Archean, but again, it was very different than it is today. For most of the Archean, it may have been a global ocean, containing no life and no oxygen, at least not in the beginning anyway. The ocean was probably green or red in color because it contained high concentrations of iron and iron-bearing minerals. And due to high concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which would have dissolved into the ocean, seawater would have been highly acidic, so there would have been very little deposition of carbonate rocks. It was during this time in the Archean, somewhere between 3.5 and 4 billion years ago, that life originated on our planet for the first time. In terms of morphology, the earliest life forms on Earth were very simple. Life started out simple and small in the Archean and did not get much larger than bacteria. Nonetheless, these simple bacteria were mighty. Not long after the origin of life, these organisms began to radically alter the rocks, oceans, and atmosphere of our planet with their metabolic reactions. They use their metabolisms to dramatically alter the landscape around them. One of the basic properties of all life is called metabolism. Your metabolism consists of the chemical reactions in your body that sustain your life and allow you to maintain your organization. There are many different types of metabolic reactions. Your cells do aerobic respiration, a chemical reaction that transforms food and oxygen into carbon dioxide and energy. In addition to respiration, Some organisms also do photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. Unlike respiration, these reactions do not release energy, but instead consume it to produce biomolecules that serve as food. Plants, for example, use their green pigments called chlorophyll for the purpose of photosynthesis. They repackage and store energy in sugars, which they can then use and consume later with respiration. Broadly speaking, there are three types of organisms today. We call plants photoautotrophs. Photoautotrophs do photosynthesis and respiration. You and I, alternatively, are examples of heterotrophs. We only do respiration. And then there's a third type of organisms, chemoautotrophs, that do respiration and a process called chemosynthesis. In chemosynthesis, organisms convert carbon-containing molecules like carbon dioxide or methane into foods like sugar using the chemical reactions involving inorganic compounds like hydrogen sulfide. Chemosynthesis is common near hydrothermal vents. There, mussels contain symbiotic bacteria that do chemosynthesis. These bacteria take hydrogen sulfide that rises from deep in the earth out to the ocean in order to produce food, which they then share with the mussels. Indeed, chemosynthesis can support an entire food web at a hydrothermal vent, despite the absence of light. Whereas photosynthesis requires sunlight, chemosynthesis does not. There's good reason to suspect that bacteria in the Archean did many, if not all, of the things that modern bacteria do. Chemosynthesis probably evolved first, along with forms of respiration that do not require oxygen. Photosynthesis and aerobic respiration that requires oxygen evolved later. That said, photoautotrophs probably had the most profound effect on the planet as a whole. Early photoautotrophs living in the Archean Ocean consumed the carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere that existed in the Archean and introduced significant amounts of oxygen into the atmosphere and planet for the first time. We call this process of adding oxygen to something, like the ocean or atmosphere, oxygenation. The ocean and atmosphere of our planet readily exchanges gases. So oxygen produced in the ocean diffused into the atmosphere, and the carbon dioxide of the atmosphere became dissolved in the ocean. Over time, carbon dioxide was converted into oxygen. The amount of CO2 in the atmosphere declined, and the atmosphere and the ocean began to become saturated with oxygen. There is plenty of evidence that photosynthesis evolved sometime in the Archean, and that oxygenation of the ocean and atmosphere began not long afterward. Layered mound-like structures called stromatolites provide some of the earliest evidence of life on Earth, and may also suggest that photoautotrophs evolved in the Archean. Some of the oldest stromatolites in the geologic record are between 3.5 and 3.8 billion years old. And we know today that stromatolites tend to form in shallow water environments. From microbial mats that trap, bind, and cement the sediment to the mound. These microbial mats generally consist of photoautotrophs like cyanobacteria, which are filaments or chains of microscopic bacteria. It stands to reason that many, if not all, stromatolites in the Archean were produced by photoautotrophs like cyanobacteria. Banded iron formations also suggest that oxygenation of the ocean and atmosphere began in the Archean. Banded iron formations are sedimentary rocks derived from hydrogenous sediment. They consist of thin-bedded or laminated strata that are usually no more than a few centimeters thick. The strata usually alternate between red and black or red and gray in color. The black or gray strata largely consist of iron oxide minerals like magnetite or hematite. The red layers, on the other hand, are typically shale, chert, or a mineral called jasper, which is made up of quartz and silica. Jasper is usually red due to the presence of iron inclusions. Banded iron formations are generally more than 15% iron in composition, and they account for more than 60% of the world's global iron reserves. Iron on our planet that is easily accessible for mining. The iron is used to produce the steel that goes into building our cities and infrastructure. There are many hypotheses concerning the origin of banded iron formations, and it may be the case that they may have formed under a variety of conditions. Generally, though, the alternation between the black and red layers are interpreted as evidence of seasonality or cyclicity in the deposition of the rock. In any case, it is thought that the banded iron formations formed as a result of chemical reactions between oxygen and iron. After all, iron is highly reactive in the presence of oxygen. Just think about rust. Rust is produced by the chemical reaction of iron and oxygen in the presence of water or air moisture. Recall that the Archean Ocean generally contained high concentrations of metals, like dissolved iron. The conventional thinking is that banded iron formations formed under these conditions, when iron minerals formed from the reaction of the dissolved iron and the oxygen produced by photoautotrophs doing photosynthesis. This graph shows the amount of banded iron formation versus geologic time. The oldest banded iron formations are more than 3 billion years old. But for some reason, most banded iron formations were produced around 2.5 billion years ago. What caused so much banded iron formation to be produced at that time? This graph illustrates the history of oxygenation. Soak it in. The x-axis is geologic time, measured in billions of years going back to the start of the Archean eon, around 4 billion years ago. The y-axis is the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere, estimated from a wealth of geological data. The oxygenation of our planet happened slowly over the course of billions of years. But there were big steps along the way. Notice how there was a big leap in the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere between 2.5 and 2 billion years ago. This leap represents one of the most significant events in the history of life and indeed the history of our planet as a whole. We refer to this event as the first great oxygenation event, even though it probably wasn't actually an event. Instead, the GOE was a period lasting hundreds of millions of years when oxygen became saturated in the atmosphere and the surface ocean of the planet for the first time. One way to think about the first GOE is as an oxygen revolution, a fundamental shift in the way our planet worked. Not only did the atmosphere start to become rich with oxygen, so did the surface of the ocean. And perhaps most incredibly, The first GOE likely caused a mass extinction of life. Organisms which had lived on Earth in the absence of oxygen now found themselves surrounded by it. For many of them, oxygen was toxic. They were killed off and went extinct during the GOE. And in their place, new life forms originated, which not only tolerated oxygen, but thrived in it. The first great oxygenation event paved the way for the origin of the first multicellular organisms on Earth, and the first large organisms that left behind macroscopic fossils. Of course, Earth's oxygen story doesn't end with the first GOE. As you can see in the graph, there was a second rise in the amount of oxygen on Earth between 600 and 500 million years ago, a second great oxygenation event. This event likely had a profound impact on animals. Not long after this second great oxygenation event, virtually all major groups of animals, including most animal phyla, originated on Earth over the span of 10 to 20 million years. We call this span of time the Cambrian explosion. It was an explosion in animal diversity, both in terms of species as well as in terms of the array of morphologies and lifestyles that were present. There is much debate about the causes of the Cambrian explosion, but many scientists believe that the second great oxygenation event was necessary for the evolution of animal life because animals have greater oxygen demands than other forms of life. Animals could not exist if oxygen levels were too low. Even after their origin, many animals continue to be influenced by changes in the amount of oxygen in the ocean and atmosphere. This graph illustrates the last 600 million years of Earth's history of oxygenation. The x-axis is geologic time measured in millions of years. And again, the y-axis is the amount of oxygen present in the atmosphere. As you can see, the amount of oxygen has fluctuated over the last 600 million years. Notably, the atmosphere contained nearly 30% more oxygen in the Carboniferous and Permian periods. Let's focus there. These periods of time are very famous for some rather unusual and freakishly large insects, like Meganeura, a giant eagle-sized dragonfly, and Arthropleura, an enormous millipede that could grow to be more than 8 feet long. Depending on how you feel about bugs and insects, you may be relieved to hear that these species are both now extinct. Regardless, the size of Meganeura and Arthropleura tell us about the amount of oxygen that was present in the atmosphere during the Carboniferous and Permian periods when they lived. Insects don't have lungs like you and I. Instead, they take in air through small tubes called trachea located along their bodies, and then oxygen diffuses into the cells of the insects along the tubes. It's not a very efficient or effective means of acquiring oxygen. Air must flow all the way down the tube before an insect can absorb any oxygen. The bigger the insect, the longer the tubes, and the greater the time it takes for air to reach the insides of the insect. Meganeura, Arthropleura, and other insects were able to grow so large in the Permian and Carboniferous because the atmosphere contained more oxygen. And so, it was easier for them to acquire enough oxygen even at the ends of their trachea. They were less limited by oxygen. As we now conclude this tour of Earth's history of oxygenation, consider this. When it comes to human needs, there was too little oxygen in the Archean and too much oxygen in the Carboniferous. Humans would not have been able to survive in either time, at least not in the way they do today. So, if you ever decide to build a machine and go bouncing around Earth history like the time traveler, make sure you bring plenty of extra oxygen with you, just in case.